was 19 years old, I was put in the cockpit of my own fighter ship. I was chipped into the ship, and I spent the next 15 years hunting down raptor nests on Mars, trying to capture mantids, and usually ending up eaten by a spider. And my other main duty was to collect human remains to be brought back to the base and regenerated, because we had so few people, we could not afford anybody to actually be gone. And my unit were the Valkyren, the Valkyries, because we were women pilots. And in German mythology, it was women who recovered the fallen heroes and brought them back to Valhalla. So the ghoul duty was in alignment with that.
I didn't know what my name was, so they were calling me Penelope Valkyren, my real first name and my unit name. So I was flying high altitude and using a computer to hunt down the Mars native raptors. I reported immediately to a German Kapitan, and his boss was a Jaco and an Alpha Drac, and he was about 13 feet tall. That would be over 3 meters tall. You know, we're talking really, really big. He was white. Okay. Alphas are all from Alpha Draconis. They are all the same race. And they are not the same race as the other planets in that system, but they have subjugated the rest of them. And they have a caste system where the alphas are always the boss. And they have a caste system inside their own society where the royals are a group of 4 or 5 small families that interbreed in such a way that they're not inbred. Most of the caste system countries on Earth have followed the same plan. My unit was all women, and we would have meetings. It's a different calendar there, but it would be basically monthly. We would have a meeting with the Draco where we were told what our basic assignments were. It was a room with a large ceiling, and he had a larger chair, and he would sit in front of us, and we would be in human-sized chairs and with tables and taking notes. And yes, the glass pads are real. That was one of the ways that the Draco tested our understanding of what we were being told. Most of it was telepathy. He would have visuals, and sometimes the visuals were telepathic and sometimes they were holographic, because the Germans had holographic imagery back in the 60s. Flight school was amazing. The first thing they did was they put a chip behind my left ear. You know, where that bone comes out. I wear glasses on Earth. I could not have worn glasses there because the chip would have been in the way. And it resembled a Bluetooth. So it was about that big. And it was stuck directly into the bone of behind my ear. And it connected to some part of my brain with a wire. And what it did was it connected me to the ship's computer, where that I became a function of the ship. So at that point, I was more human than cyborg, but I was definitely part of the computer. So we were a unit rather than being as an individual. And there was also a chip that would have been here, and it was star-shaped. And it produced a visual where I didn't need a window or a screen. Whatever the ship needed me to see would appear. It looked physical to me, but it wasn't. Nobody else could see it.
Right.
And it would give all of the temperature and wind and everything you needed as a pilot. And if I were on the base and saw someone, it would give me all the information I would need about that person, name, rank, duties, and whether or not they were a friendly. Well, we called it Militia Heimschild, Martian home shield. That's what we called our militia. And Mars Defense Force was under us. My first ship looked a lot like an F-15, except instead of having a jet engine, it had plasma engines. Plasma engines were new technology when I was put in the ship. So that would have been 1974 when I was put into the ship and graduated from Schule to Militia Heimschild as a pilot. That was amazing. I don't know how to explain it. Sitting in the cockpit, I had a mouse that was shaped to fit my hand. And as I moved, the ship moved too. And I had another set of, it feels like a joystick that I used to fire weapons. And I would get this whole set of printouts, and I would tell the computer mentally what we were looking for on this mission. Because I would be sent out for different things. I was sent to find raptor nests, basically their homes, and destroy them if they were small, or if they were a cluster, I was to get backup. I would also be sent out on ghoul duty, Ghoul. A ghoul is someone who frequents cemeteries and steals bodies. Okay. My job on those missions was to find human remains and bring them back to the base, because we had regeneration tanks and we could bring them back from the dead. And I brought back a lot of the Mars native humans because the raptors liked to eat them. We had some pretty nasty weapons on there. We had laser cannon, we had missiles, we had something that's basically a tactical nuke. So one of our planes show up, and that was like the cavalry had shown up. I was considered too dangerous to be around civilians. The few times that I was around civilians, they treated me like I was a hero, but it really felt weird. It did. I mean, you're alone in a ship, you're merged with the ship, and then when you're around people, you don't know how to interact with them. I mean, you can speak the same language, but you're hearing their thoughts, whether they know it or not. And a lot of their thoughts are mingled with fear. And the ones that aren't, you know, I never thought of myself as a hero. I thought of myself as someone doing a job that had to be done. I don't feel like a hero now for talking about it. I have this mission to expose the kidnapping and hopefully stop it. There is nothing we do out there that can't be done by consenting adults. So there should be plenty of consenting adults to man all the space agencies. Well, I mostly lived at the base. We had satellite bases around the planet because of the storms. And it would lift a lid and you'd fly in and then it would close. Everything was underground. That's why so much of the stuff doesn't show up on Google Mars. And the few things that do are blurred because they don't want you to know it's there. But you'll see some weird little brick building out in the middle of nowhere. No windows, just this weird little brick building, maybe 3 meters square, and a door. And you go inside and it's an elevator that takes you down. And you stay there till the storm's over. Productivity is a really big deal for all the Martian bases. It's a big deal on all the German ships. It's nobody is allowed to freeload. If you get hurt, you are allowed time to heal, and after that, you're back to work. It's not like slavery. It's more like everybody pulls their weight. It takes a certain amount of stuff to take care of you, and you are expected to put out that much effort.
And I went through several ships during the 15 years that I was in service there. The one in the drawing was the last one I had, and it looks more like a shuttle. I had a lot more duties that involved recovering dead bodies. It's in between a military plane and a shuttle, and it was camouflaged. Most of the Mars militia wore shades of orange or brown camo, and the ships were camouflaged so they would blend in. And but you see, our uniform flight suit was in between a spacesuit and a regular flight suit, and there were hoses attached for when the helmet was on, and you can breathe the air. You just can't run fast. It's like being in the high mountains. But once you get used to it, you get used to it. My plane had the capability of coming straight down like a helicopter and then picking straight up. So I could land in some really strange places as long as it was, the size frame was about twice the size of my ship was what I needed to be able to land.
I would be on a mission for about 4 days by myself, and I would land every 8 hours or so to eat and sleep, whatever I had to do. Sometimes they would pick those times to send me to do intel. That would require capturing mantid or raptor. And they preferred I get the smaller raptors because, one, they were more likely to talk, and secondly, they were less likely to kill me. We didn't have a lot of population relative to the size of the planet, number one. Number two, they knew where I was because the ship was always reporting home. And even though I was not infantry, I had been trained for self-defense. That was part of this specialization training in Shula. We were taught how to defend ourselves from the native population. It required faster reflexes than I usually had. But I was telepathic, so I could hear them thinking. But mantids don't use the full intimacy telepathy that the Draco do. So they're capable of deceit. And so they would basically play, follow me, follow me, follow me, into a cave. I was engaged by a mantid, a Mars mantid, and she read my mind, and we had been taught to not even try to read it. So I let her read me. I was supposed to capture her for intel, and it ended up she got intel out of me instead. Because it was just one-on-one, and at that point I was pretty much helpless, it let me go. But it made it clear that she thought I was a demon from their perspective because I was working with the Germans. And I reported it when I got back. Apparently I didn't know anything that would matter, or I had been fed disinfo. So they were okay with it. I was not in trouble, and they didn't have to come find me. Usually when they sent me after a mantid, they would duck into a cave, and they have telepathy with the Mars spiders. Spiders on Earth, the biggest I've ever seen even photos of are about a meter across, and those are in the Middle East. The ones on Mars get to be 5 meters across.
And they hide out in caves, and they're telepathic with the mantids. The mantids keep them like we do working dogs. When the mantids get in trouble, they'll call a spider to take care of the problem. You know, like sicken a dog on them. And when I've chased mantids on foot, they invariably duck into a cave and call in a spider, and I wake up in a regen tank. They like to bite you in the stomach, and they have 2 sets of mandibles, one over the other. And the venom burns like fire, but it works very, very fast, so it doesn't hurt very long. I had weapons, but I was supposed to capture them alive. And spiders are fast. You know, you're talking about a large animal that can cover a lot of space faster than you can even notice them. And when you're concentrating on catching one critter and another one comes at you, and they're smart like dogs.
They're very aggressive. When we would be out in the field, if we got hungry, we would hunt down a spider and cook it, and they taste like crab. So we were hunting them as much as they were hunting us. But they have the option of killing you or just feeding on you. There are folks that I know that have come forward that have had legs chomped off by the creature just wanting to immobilize them and then use them long term, because they can feed off of you until you actually die. And they don't eat flesh and bone. They eat the liquids. So they have to be kept warm or everything solidifies, and so they can feed on you longer if they keep you alive. Yeah. So from their perspective, it's you know, lunch lasts longer.
And I have been dinner for Mars spiders more than once. And my assumption is that my ship would report I was dead and they would send a party out to rescue me, bring me back, because I would always wake up in the regen tank. And when I finally got to where I didn't fall for it anymore, I actually caught a few and brought them back for intel.
Once or twice.
It wasn't just once or twice. This was a part of the regular, what I could be told to do. We were at war with them. You needed some sort of intelligence to know how you were doing against them, to know where to make the next bombing run. At that point, they were more living in ships than on world, and most of our bombing runs were based on the planet's surface, or what we assumed were just below surface dwellings. And you really have to catch one of them to know. And the Mantids are a hive mind race. So when you catch one of them, you have access to all of it, if they don't kill themselves first, which we had a lot of them that were captured just shut down. They basically sacrificed the individual to keep from telling anything.
It's a very different kind of a mind, and I cannot imagine their individual lives are completely structured and they have no choices. And if that kind of society structure were applied to Earth, it would be unbearable.
It took them a while to understand that we would go into shock under torture. Metabolic shock, that you just die. So we had a lot of our soldiers die during their interrogations simply because they didn't know about shock. Same thing with the Raptors. It took them a while to figure things out. I mean, you capture somebody, you think you're going along fine, and they just die on you. Well, the thing that I experienced was with a raptor. And first you have the terror, this creature that is 7 foot tall, so about a half meter taller than I was, and a couple of 100 pounds heavier, with claws that are long and sharp as razors, and they're coming up and putting their hand on your shoulder while they're talking to you in your head, and they know I understand them because they picked up on that right away, that I was telepathic, unlike the Germans. And they sensed the Draco hybridization because they had dealt with Draco for millennia. And so they looked at me and it was, you're different. And then they would start digging telepathically into that difference that the Germans had taught me to despise. Oh yeah. If anybody's worse than your average New Ager about Draco, it's Germans. Yeah. Most humans on Earth have heard a lot of bullshit about Draco, and they think that they're automatically evil. They just have a different cultural viewpoint. Where humans give honor to the concept of love, but really betray it all the time, Draco give honor to the concept of honor, and they stand by it. So there's a major difference in worldview. But when it comes down to actually doing what the quality is that you value, the Draco do it and humans don't. I don't remember how I got captured. That's one of those you're there moments. And I have a hand with 8-inch claws on it, on my shoulder. And it's tapping. So I'm feeling the claws through my flight suit. And I'm like, And the emotional of it took over. And my ship responded to the panic attack. and called Achilles Prima for backup. And I don't remember actually being hurt physically, but I remember the fullness of the raptor in my head, finding every point that was a weakness and digging in. And it was just a panic attack that wouldn't stop. And then I blacked out. And when I came to, I was in the regen tank back on Achilles Klima. Well, my ship can fly itself. It didn't really need me. But because we were connected through the chip, it knew when I was in trouble because it was monitoring my emotions. So they told me that I had gone into metabolic shock. And they said, we know you're telepathic. We know there's stronger telepaths than you are. We're not mad at you. The regen tanks don't deal with mental. So if I fought too much, then my mind would have been gone and I would have been useless to the Germans. And yes, there were humans there that were so much like us that the computers picked them up as us. So I would be looking for humans, Earth humans, and end up with a lot of the Mars humans too. And so we regenerated a lot of their people. And they were a very spiritual, pacifist people.
They dress like ancient Hindus, and with the sari.
They're about 7 foot tall because the gravity is less there. They have larger chests because there's less air pressure. So they have to breathe in more to get enough air. But their basic features, they look a lot like Apache. So they have an orange tint to their skin, which is probably dietary. They live in underground cities, and when we would approach them, they would pack up and leave. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with Earth humans. They wanted to just live in peace. Their language is basically the same as Sumerian. So at one point, either we were a colony from them or they were a colony from us, because they are us. They worship the female. The female is considered the giver of life, and they go around bare-breasted because that's the source of milk. And they're treated extremely protectively by the males and honored. And when the Earth males saw this, they've ended up raping many, many, many of their women. And this is part of why they move. They had a very spiritual belief system, and like a lot of native peoples on Earth, they were seriously taken advantage of by the Earth humans.
We're a primitive race. We are a primitive race, and people who don't understand that don't understand why ETs who have interacted with us don't care what happens to us.
That we would revive them, put them in clothes, drop them off wherever they wanted. Some of our people would try to figure out how to talk to them. They were in awareness way above where we were. I wouldn't venture to guess at what level they were. Okay. But they were able to pull stuff off that shocked us. If they had chosen to be combatants, they would have been formidable.
They have to live underground just like all other humans and the mantids, and The raptors live above ground. So they are very much adapted to Mars. They come out in the daytime. But if you're growing things underground, you have to have a power source and a light source for your crops and a way to melt the water. Almost all the water on Mars is underground and frozen. So you have to mine it and then melt it. And it's considered to be a fossil. So one of the conditions that the Draco put on us was that we only could take what we were using and that we had to recycle what we used, so that we were only taking a little bit, because once that water is gone, it's gone. There is some surface water, there is some rain, there's some snow in the winter, but it's not enough to support more than what natively survived the disasters in the past. There are 10 million Germans on Mars. We're talking high population. That's not counting the Americans that are there. That's not counting the slaves that are there. There are more slaves than there are regular population. And that's not counting the ICC people that are there. Neuschwabenland has a small population there. The majority of it moved to a new city on Mars. We already have major cities there. The place is self-sufficient. The capital of German Das Bundes is on Mars, not in Antarctica. That's Neu-Berlin. I have been there. I don't remember where it is. The size, it was 500,000 people when I was there. Okay. And this was a different altar. And so it was about 2015. The public needs to know Mars is livable. Mars has other races there, and that every faction in space uses Mars for their basic training. The American space programs are through the Navy. So none of those have been declassified yet. They are from the Department of Defense's space program, which has been going on since the 1980s. Or they are from Solar Warden, which is a separate program. What Trump called Space Force used to be called Earth Defense Force, and it was part of the Air Force. Mars Defense Force works under German High Command, and they work side by side with several American components. The Space Marines are one of them. Solar Warden is aware of them, but I'm not sure how much Solar Warden knows, because we didn't interact a lot. But I know that when they came to the ICC bases, they would make sure that they checked in with us before they did. Because our policy was, if you didn't check in with Mars Defense Force, you got shot down. That's actually what happened to the American and Soviet and later Russian probes that were sent to Mars. They didn't check in with Mars Defense Force, so they got shot down. And so you notice at a certain point that the probes started being allowed, and the solar panels would be cleaned so that these robots didn't die. And they would see little things, but they really didn't see much because they're in
craters, and they would kind of be blocked from seeing things that the Germans didn't want the Americans on Earth to see.
Mars Defense Force has satellites in orbit. We have a specific flight path that you have to take into Ares Prime. If you've never been to Mars before, if you give us where you're going, you'll be escorted in and out. Mars Defense Force takes it seriously that we have already had a long-standing war with the raptors and the mantids. We finally achieved territorial treaties that everybody's willing to live with. And they really didn't want outsiders. They were very picky about which humans they accepted. You had to have a certain IQ level. They're trying to create a master race there. Something that is a superhuman, smarter than Earth humans, stronger than Earth humans. And in the process, they've completely deprived all freedom. It's a police state run by the military. It's not a fun place to be, but at the same time, they're creating a kind of human race superior in most aspects to what we have on Earth. They took the cream of the cream in the 60s and 70s. Remember, they talked about the brain drain then. The brain drain was because they were taking those people to Mars and Ceres. The two colonies were set up in competition with each other. In the German system, everybody has a competitor. The idea is if you compete with somebody all the time, then both will improve. And they do give you rewards, which they never do on Earth. But in the German system, if you win, you will be rewarded. Things that matter in that culture. But they were deliberately taking the cream of the cream. And they made them all kinds of promises, but when they got to Mars and Ceres, they were basically slaves. The idea was to get these top-notch people and have them in their own culture. And the result was that stock was removed from Earth. So we, average, ended up dumber. And they ended up a lot smarter because they didn't have the dumber people. The only way the average human on Earth now is going to be allowed to Mars is as a slave, and most of them are converted into cyborgs and sold to ETs. It's a police force and military because of the wars. I had very military applications. It's more like Mars Coast Guard plus a militia and police all rolled into one. Mm-hmm. And since there is no freedom allowed on the planet, you step out of line and you're zapped. Most of the citizens have chips where they get a sharp pain if they even think a thought that's not acceptable. Everybody's monitored by the central computer at the colony that they're assigned to. Ares Prime has a quantum computer that is self-aware. Most of the larger ships have quantum computers that are becoming self-aware. So yeah, there's tech out there that'll blow your mind. Seeing what was done with cybernetics in Mars Defense Force and in Nachtwaffen is why I'm so against the singularity. I have friends who claim that it'll be completely voluntary. I don't believe that. what we have seen in other planets and systems is that once the AI starts voluntary, pretty soon you've got quantum computers running the culture, and before long, to compete for a job, you have to become cybernetic. And it becomes a matter of personal survival. And at that point, it's no longer voluntary. And there's always a few holdouts, but eventually the cybernetics will hunt them down and kill them as competitors. And eventually the AI aspect will kill off all of the carbon-based life forms in that system.
I know there was a CIA presence there from the time I got there, because Andy Bajago talks about that he showed up at Aries Prime about the same time that I did, within a couple of years, and that he was in a section for very important people, according to the CIA, and that most of those kids had been seen in the chronovisors to become leaders in either America or Europe. And so they were there to be taught the truth from the CIA perspective about what space was about. At the base on Mars, there were, I think, about a half dozen Alpha Dracs that showed up on a regular basis. The one that my boss reported to showed up at least once a week.
My boss was a purebred German, and he was not hardwired for his boss, who was a purebred Alpha Drac. And most of the crew were like me. We had been modified to live around them. So the boss would come in, make his presentation, the Draco would show up,
and he would chase off my boss so he wouldn't end up dying, and he would run the session. And we were supposed to tell him what was discussed afterwards. And we would be told about various treaties that were in progress, who we were not supposed to shoot, who we were supposed to shoot if we saw them, and which of the various American groups on Mars we were supporting and which we were going to deliberately ignore. There were lots of American groups there. And some of them knew about each other and some of them didn't. Some of them knew about us and some of them didn't. If they got permission from the Draco or from Mars Home Shield, then they were allowed on world. Otherwise, they would be shot down in orbit. I know that I flew air support for Randy Kramer's group, Mars Defense Force. They were there under contract where the Germans were in charge of them. So they were like we hired mercenaries, basically. So because they were working for us, we did air support for their missions. There was another group, I can't remember the name for them, but they were doing similar things in the southern hemisphere all on their own. And we were supposed to leave them alone like they didn't exist, like we were a secret to them. So I would occasionally fly over and the computer would automatically turn the screen on, the cloak, so that they wouldn't be able to see my ship at all. I was a lieutenant. I got up to a second lieutenant while I was on Mars. The U.S. Navy does not have a second lieutenant, but the Germans operate like their Luftwaffe. That was what their space was formed out of. So they have Luftwaffe ranks. So I was told I was U.S. Navy on loan to the Germans. and that my rank with the Navy was a lieutenant. I don't even remember owning the clothing. I remember I would take a shower and take my clothes off and leave them stacked on the chair in the bathroom. And when I came out, there would be clean ones. And I never knew if they were the ones I had worn before or not, or if they were someone else's. That continued even through my military career, even into Nachtwaffen. You didn't own anything. Nothing was yours. It belonged to the community. That's part of why I don't believe this rebel alliance exists, or if it does not include any of the Germans, because you don't own anything. And we all had a chip in our head that if we thought about rebelling, we would get a serious headache. If we kept thinking about it, we'd have a seizure. And if we really kept thinking about it, our head would be blown off and we would wake up in the regeneration tank. You wore fancier clothes on the bridge. It was a formal occasion, but not party formal. Party formals, the uniforms were white, but on the bridge they were black, where the guys that were working or the guys that kept things clean, they would wear gray coveralls. And those things were comfortable, probably the best fitting of any of the uniforms. The women tended to be in things that were form-fitting and made us look feminine, and unless we were in a battle situation. In a battle situation, we would be in the female version of armor. And it wasn't like they draw in comic books. We were actually covered in armor, like the guys. They didn't want us dead.
The food. You have replicator food most of the time. And you take the waste products, the trash, anything that's shabby, all the stuff that would normally go into the dump here goes into the recycling that feeds the replicators. And they literally change it at the molecular level. And there are 7 basic meal plans, and that's what the replicator makes. You can get new uniforms. It's all computer settings, and you tell it your measurements, and it'll make a uniform to match. And shoes. You put your foot on a pad so it'll get the right shape for the inside, because not everyone's feet are the same. We had a lot of worker Draco and Greys that also had uniforms.
Basically, you would call them 3D printers. We had prepackaged foods that I'm not sure where they were manufactured, but you just added water and heated them. And most of them were carbs, carbohydrate based. The ones we had were mostly dehydrated imitations of German food. Schnitzel. Sausages with potatoes were a real popular item. Oatmeal, something they called muesli for breakfast. The inevitable powdered eggs that they have in any military. We would have desserts once in a while. There was an ET fruit that they brought in. I don't know where it was from. It looked like bananas, but tasted like strawberries. It was actually pretty good. And we had our hydroponic gardens where we grew a lot of fresh greens. When I first got there, it was mostly salad greens, and later on they added in other vegetables. They got larger. The grounds for it spread out more as we got more people. So they grew more things. The fresh food was grown hydroponically. We had grow lights, and we took really good care of it because that was the only really decent food we had. In America, they talk about they're starting to grow things like hamburger from cells.
Yeah.
We were doing that with pork, and it would take it a while to grow. So the day we got shaved pork from the cells, that was like a really special treat to have actual meat instead of something dehydrated or from the replicator. But we didn't have dairy at all. So there was no milk. Cheeses came, but they were in the prepackaged stuff. I will say that their macaroni and cheese was excellent. If you put the right amount of water in and cooked it exactly the right length of time in the microwave, it came out like baked Italian macaroni and cheese, the good stuff. They had us on a lot of production enhancement drugs. So once I was actually military instead of a student, we had a lot of drugs to enhance performance. And that required we do regen. Every week was what they aimed for, but the drugs destroyed your liver. And you know, if you're having to be regenerated once a week, that it's major destruction. It's something you should not be taking. First off, you get water from underground. Mars has a frozen ocean about a mile underground in the northern hemisphere and about 3 miles underground in the southern hemisphere. The dirt level is almost 2 miles lower in the northern hemisphere than the south. So it's like something sucked all the dirt away. And there were competing stories from ETs about what happened. Just put it that way. The water comes from these frozen oceans. And when it froze, all the salt went to the bottom. So as you chip away at the ice, you've got fresh drinking water. But it's fossil water. Once it's all gone, it's gone. So we've been very protective of it. You can't just go and mine it without permission from high command. And that was something I think the Draco insisted on, because they tend to protect the resources of the worlds they own. Humans don't do that. But when we do take the water, it's recycled and purified and cleaned, and all the stuff we did to it is taken out of it. Now, you need to know showers and things like that are not with water. They're with sound. You are actually bathed with sound instead of water. You don't use soap because you can't dissolve it in sound. But it strips all the excess oils off your skin and takes off the sweat and the dirt and everything. It does an excellent job. You go into, it's like glass doors, and it's a rectangular shape, and the sound comes from the top of it like a ceiling. And whatever dirt and stuff is on you does collect at the bottom. So that has to be cleaned up after. So you do have to clean the shower. And you come out and you're dry and you put your clean clothes on. And the toilet also operates under a combination of air and sound. And you don't have to use paper to clean yourself. It's like a bidet, except that it's sound and air, and you come out dry. It's really a lot more efficient than what we use on Earth. And they recycle everything. Everything gets recycled. The base was powered through zero-point energy. They literally took it out of the spin of the planet. I know it was from the angular momentum of the spin, because there was a big argument just before I left there about that if they had too many of those machines, they would slow down the orbit and make the day longer and possibly shift it out of the Goldilocks zone. So they were actually paying attention to the side effects of their technology and were considering using a different kind of technology to power things. If it sensed a person, the lights would go on, and they were not incandescent, there weren't light bulbs, there were strips along the walls that were about this big, and however long they needed to be for the room. And between them, they would send sound waves, and it would make the light. So it was a diffuse kind of a light, not a single big bright thing in the middle of the room. And there was a sleep cycle for the dorms. So at a certain point, the light simply went out. And if you weren't where you were supposed to be, you were shit out of luck.
The Germans officially play classical music, mostly German composers. The officers' theme song is Jupiter from Holst's The Planets. And we have, you know how the British have made a hymn out of it? We have the words translated into German, and we sing that every day on ships or on bases. That's the theme song for the military. And the enlisted men, their theme song is Mars from the same symphony. So it's considered to be too martial for the officers.
Wagner is actually considered to be too violent. They used a lot of 19th century and early 20th century composers, and they weren't all Germans. Some were, they liked Debussy, they liked Tchaikovsky, but once in a while, the CO would decide to play this bootleg rock and roll.
We sometimes get bootlegged music and movies and other recordings, because when you put things on radio or TV, when we were broadcasting, over the air, that goes into space, and we were picking that up. So, depending on your captain, your ship's commander, some of them would play the stuff for you and some of them wouldn't. Some of them it was contraband, and others it was, what the hell, have fun. So we would be out there and hear Earth's music and then be sent back. And when it comes in, it's like, that sounds so familiar.
The MarsNet is the official internet of Mars, and you are given access to the parts you need for your job. It's more like the dark web on Earth than the public internet, because you only get access to what you need for your work. You can't just browse.
And number 5, was a talented, intuitive linguist with incredible computer skills. And he is who set up the MarsNet. He had tons of documents from Earth with history, with schematics, with everything that you can imagine an entire military would need. And he was uploading them to the MarsNet in English, Russian, and German. And he was the one translating in between. That's all he did. And most of the time he was in an office on Eris Prima until we were moved to Neu-Berlin. That was because the Draco owned Eris Prima, and the price of the rent was more than we were willing to pay. It was so many humans turned over to them every year. And so we sublet it to the CIA. They are paying so many humans every year. That's still ongoing. The lease was for 100 years and 100 Mars years. And a year is your orbit. Mars' orbit is longer than Earth's. Mars' day is only a couple of hours longer. Mm-hmm. Not a big deal, but that year is longer. And the Draco are not bad in a lot of ways. They stopped eating Germans. They decided we were good, better military partners than food objects. At least we accomplished that. It's been interesting interacting with ETs that considered us like we consider chimpanzees, and watching them gain respect for us the longer they worked with us.
Okay. In the German civilization out there, they found that productivity was improved by sexual activity. So everybody's encouraged to have sex. But it's supposed to be unemotional and no attachments. Just pure animal level sex. And I had this problem that I fell in love with the man. And he had been at Langley with me. I was number 7 and he was number 5. So we had this whole time we had known each other. Came up the ranks together. And he was seen as somewhat effeminate, where I was seen as somewhat masculine. And so they approved of the relationship.
You know, we knew each other and had a lot in common, so it was like a natural relationship. And I really cared for him. You get attached to people. I can't help it. And I was sent to investigate reports of officers being captured by Mars raptors. And I got there and it was him.
And I don't know how he got captured. He was never out of the base. He should never have been captured. The way they have the screens for the pilot set up, you can see the target, like you're in there with them. And I saw him basically in the center of a group of them eating him alive.
Now, we had spent 30 years together. Okay, this was someone I loved. And no, we weren't allowed to have a marriage, but this was a long-term committed relationship. And to find him being eaten alive by Mars raptors, I did a female response instead of a military response. And I panicked. And my ship interpreted the panic as fire all weapons.
It completely destroyed the nest. Now, they used the timestamp on the computer for when they fired the weapons as the target time to go back and rescue him. We would redial to get him out.
My commander informed me that I could no longer be trusted with those kinds of weapons, that I was no longer fit for duty. And so I was transferred off Mars into Nachtwaffen, the actual German space military. And it's a plural because they have more than one fleet involved. Luftwaffe was singular because it was Air Force. Nachtwaffen is the combination of all of the colony, militia, and the main military. So it's more than one, and it's large, and it's 400 years old, and has a great deal of power. And a lot of places to bury somebody who's talented but can't be trusted. And so that's what they did to me. They put me on a freighter where I would be supporting the Armada in its actions on behalf of the Draco, but that I would not be in a position where I could actually do any harm. I got to say goodbye to him before I was shipped out. And they injected me with some form of, they called it birth control, but it eliminated my sex drive. And I was not allowed any kind of personal relationships at all. The only person I had any contact with on a regular basis was the woman who shared the room with me. And my understanding was she had also gotten in trouble. And when he was on Earth afterwards, because we all get sent back, he worked for the Air Force in the Russian translation department. He sounded Lithuanian. I met him real world here and now in 2013, and he was the agent who activated my memories. And they used him because they knew I would trust him. And then the CIA killed him in 2016.
So basically my punishment for falling in love was that I was going to be sent off world. And the skills I had meant that I was going to be either a pilot or a navigator for something else. And the ship that I was transferred to had a quantum computer in 1990, and I was stronger chipped to it, so the mind control would be stronger.
I'm usually trapped on the inner section of the ship because I have a connection to the ship's computer that makes me a potential security leak. A pure telepath can get into my head and access that chip and connect to the ship's computer and get through all the defenses. So I have to have that connection to do my job, but it makes me a security risk. So from the time I was transferred off Mars, I was de facto a prisoner on the freighter that I served on for 25 years. I was not allowed out of that security zone.
I had a room that I shared with another woman who was also a navigator. And I was allowed between my room, the navigation room, the bridge, the officer's mess, and the hallways in between. I grew up on Mars before I grew up on Earth. Because when they sent me back, the age regressed me back to 4. Because the machine can be set for an age and a weight. So I grew up on Mars became an adult, and then got sent back to grow up again on Earth. So that's home. And that explains why I've always felt like an outsider here. Like something isn't right. So when I've seen some of the videos of Mars that have been taken by some of the probes, the first one I saw, I just sat there and sobbed for hours. People don't understand how that can be, how you can be so homesick for a place that they think you've never actually been. But once you accept the technologies used, that they have time travel, that they can age regress your body back to whatever age, and bringing you back from the dead on top of that. Once those are factored in, everything becomes possible.